from Washington, D.C.
Tonight, in the driver's seat, the AI trade keeps Wall Street climbing, pushing the S&P 500 above 7,600 and its longest winning streak since May of last year. President Trump signing a scaled-back executive order on oversight for advanced AI models after scrapping a tougher version last month. And primary day in America, voters in 6 states head to the polls, testing Democratic incumbents, California's new map, and a pair of Senate battlegrounds, all against the backdrop of war, inflation anxiety, and a race for control of Washington in November. And not moving forward, period. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche confirms to Congress the Trump White House is definitively dropping plans for a $1.8 billion fund for victims of alleged government weaponization. But the ban on the IRS auditing Trump and his businesses remains active. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
And Kaylee, we kick off our coverage tonight with the latest from the administration in the conflict with Iran. The president saying he remains optimistic the U.S. can reach a deal with Iran soon, despite the regime threatening to halt all talks over Israel's military operation in southern Lebanon. Here's what the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, had to say about the state of talks in his first public testimony on Capitol Hill since the conflict with Iran began.
There is the prospect before us, which could happen today, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, that for the first time, certainly in my memory, they have agreed to negotiate aspects of their nuclear program that just a month ago, just a year ago, they were refusing to even mention, much less enter into discussions about.
For the latest, we turn now to Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian, who joins us live from the North Lawn of the White House. Courtney, it's great to have you back on with us. It was last Friday that President Trump said he was preparing to make a final determination as he entered the Situation Room for what was framed as a very important, if not determinative, meeting. We still have no word from him tonight. Does he plan to let us know soon?
It seems that the president wants to continue these talks. As you said, Rubio mentioned that Iran is willing to talk about its nuclear program. It was unclear. He didn't give any details on which elements they are willing to talk about, but said that the Strait of Hormuz needs to reopen with no tolls in order for these talks to continue. This, of course, is all being complicated by Israel's ongoing actions in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. The president said he spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday. The two leaders had very different readouts on this phone call, which reportedly got pretty heated, according to several media reports. But this all underscores a big question that has emerged as this war drags on, and that is, are the U.S. and Israel aligned on their objectives and how this war should come to an end? And right now, that's not very clear that they're on the same page. And that, I think, continues to threaten these ongoing talks with Iran.
Well, it's incredible that the talks with Iran and the U.S.'s path forward may now be informed in part by Bill Pulte, who was tapped by Trump today as the acting director of national intelligence. Meantime, Courtney, another acting cabinet secretary, the acting attorney general Todd Blanche, just confirmed to Congress that the administration is definitively dropping the planned $1.8 billion so-called weaponization fund, but not the IRS audit that is going forward, or the ban on audits, rather?
Yes, so the administration is crucially honoring a part of the deal that bars any future investigations into the president's tax dealings or his business's tax dealings, his family's tax dealings. And this, of course, is drawing some skepticism from folks on Capitol Hill who were also pushing back against this weaponization fund. It's unclear exactly whether this is something that they're going to pause or they're going to continue with as these legal challenges play out with the weaponization fund. But it is another way in which the administration seems to be protecting the president from any future investigations that may emerge should the Democrats retake Congress after the midterm elections.
Is this it then? Is that the final word from Todd Blanche, not moving forward with this fund? The Speaker of the House says it's being put aside. Will we have anything more definitive?
We've been trying to seek clarity from the White House on this, but as far as we know, they're letting these court cases play out. The Justice Department said that they have agreed to honor the decision to pause the weaponization fund. And this has drawn a lot of scrutiny, both from Democrats and Republicans. It has not been popular among the president's party. So we'll see how this plays out. And I think they're waiting to see how it plays out as well.
All right, Bloomberg's Courtney Subramanian live from the White House North Lawn. Thank you so much. And joining us now for more is Congressman Suhas Subramanyam, Democrat of Virginia and ranking member on the Oversight Committee on Military and Foreign Affairs. Congressman, thank you for being with us live from Capitol Hill this evening. Just on the DOJ now dropping definitively this $1.8 billion fund, is this objectively good news? Is it enough to satiate you and your colleagues who are upset over this deal, or do you need to see the audit question resolved too?
Well, we need to see the audit questions resolved, but it's good news for now. What we know about this administration is when they have a grift in mind, they're going to continue to try to pursue it, even when the courts try to stop them. And so it's good that they have dropped it for now. I think they needed to drop it in order to get a reconciliation bill passed. It wasn't going to pass otherwise. But we'll see what happens throughout the summer and into the winter, whether they still try to push it forward.
Well, there are some Republicans who have talked about crafting legislation to this end. I know that some Democrats have already drawn it up to keep the president or vice president from pursuing claims like these. Congressman, do you want to see that specifically if Democrats take control of the House to keep this or future administrations from pursuing a slush fund like this?
Absolutely. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you should be angry about this slush fund. And I don't care if it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, we should be stopping these kinds of moves because they're bad for our democracy, they're bad for the American people, and it's a terrible waste of taxpayer dollars.
Congressman, given that you are overseeing the ranking member on the subcommittee of military and foreign affairs. Obviously, United States foreign affairs-oriented decisions and military decisions are informed by United States intelligence. And I wonder what your reaction is to the tapping of Bill Pulte, who, of course, has been leading the FHFA, as director of national intelligence today, at least on an acting basis. It's unclear whether or not he would need to go through the full nomination and confirmation process. But is he qualified for this?
No, he's absolutely not qualified for this. And in his current role, he has simply just carried out the president's agenda against political enemies. And that's what he's expected to do in his intelligence role. And so that's why he was tapped to do this. It's not because he was at all qualified. It's because the president wants him to go after political enemies using our country's intelligence service. And that's a scary thought for someone like me who's a Democrat. It should be a scary thought for all Americans. In the end, our intelligence agencies are so critical to our national security. To have someone completely unqualified running them is deeply concerning.
So who should be worried? Congressman, you used to be an advisor for former President Barack Obama. Does he need to worry now that this has taken place, or other political enemies of Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, first of all, I don't think Bill Pulte would even be confirmed by the Senate. I hope I'm right about that, and I hope Republicans in the Senate don't prove me wrong there. But second, yeah, this is, again, part of an agenda to go after political enemies. That's why Todd Blanche is the acting attorney general as well. You're going to start to see more people in these acting roles in the administration try to carry out the president's agenda against political enemies and carry out the president's agenda even when it's deeply unpopular with that person or with the American people.
Joe mentioned your work advising former President Obama. You were advising him specifically in tech policy. So in the tech policy realm, I wonder if you view the AI executive order signed by President Trump today, essentially enabling government agencies and AI companies to work together to head off cybersecurity risk from advanced AI models. If you think this is adequate, a 30-day window voluntarily for government agencies to be able to review new models before their release.
Yeah, you said it yourself, voluntary, right? So the good guys will come and work with us. right? It should be mandatory. I think in the end, if you're going to be developing products that could have an adverse impact on the nation, we should at least have the ability to take a look. In this framework, the good guys and the good actors will come and have their models examined, but the bad actors will not. They will choose not to. This is also very limited in scope. It was really disappointing overall. There's some good stuff in there. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm saying that we need more comprehensive policy when it comes to AI, including these models. And I think Congress needs to act. I don't think it should be done just by executive order.
Well, so let's hear more about that, Congressman, because we've spent so much time talking about the need for guardrails. The regulation's clearly not keeping up with this very quickly evolving technology. As a former tech advisor to the president and as somebody who represents the data center capital of the United States of America, what do you need to see now? This won't be the president forever. There's going to be another administration that needs to get its arms around this. What can Democrats in Congress do today?
We need to see legislation on regulating these frontier AI models and the development of them. We also need to see some policy making on protecting the workforce and the future of the workforce in AI. It's having terrible consequences for entry-level students even and people across the economy. When you see policy on data centers.
Would you consider a moratorium on data centers? How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I think localities should be able to do moratoriums, but a national moratorium is going too far because in the end, what's the concern I have is that we have to build data centers to keep up with the AI products that are coming out right now if we want to continue to be a leader. And so we need to do siting better. And so I'm looking into legislation that calls for looking into where to put the data centers so it has the power infrastructure needed so it's not hurting communities and steamrolling communities. And this all needs to be done in Congress.
Well, we'll look toward that potential future legislation. Meanwhile, it's a different piece of legislation, a resolution, really, that is expected to be on the floor of your chamber tomorrow on war powers. It was, of course, pulled by House leadership before the Memorial Day recess over concern it would pass. Even if it does pass tomorrow, what's the consequence, knowing the president can just choose to ignore it, to veto it?
Well, I think it's symbolic. If the House of Representatives, which is controlled by President Trump and a House of Representatives that he has very much controlled from the very beginning, if they vote for a war powers resolution, that is a message to the president and this administration that the Congress that he supposedly controls is against his policies in the Middle East and this war. And so I think it's a symbolic vote. Yes, he would veto it, but I think it's an important vote to have and an important message to send to the president.
Congressman, it's good to have you back. Suhas Subramanyam, Democrat of Virginia. We thank you for joining us, as always, on Bloomberg. Wall Street powered higher once again today, despite a lack of positive developments with Iran. The S&P 500 closing above 7,600. The Dow hit an all-time high. Meantime, Palo Alto Networks, after the bell, surging now on the back of a beat and raise quarter. The company shares up some 60% so far this year. So much for the SaaSpocalypse. We turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's live at World Headquarters in New York. Where should we start here, Romaine?
Yeah, well, it is that AI trade that continues to drive this market. Joe, as you note here, with the S&P hitting another record high, but the second line on the screen there for your viewers, that is the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, the chips, up 6% on the day. And believe it or not, they posted that gain without the biggest weighting in the market, NVIDIA, which was actually in the red. And it was largely because of comments from CEO Jensen Huang, not about his company, but about one of his partners, Marvell Technology. It's a much smaller chip company, and he said it could be the next trillion-dollar company. It was a pretty bullish statement, given that prior to today, that company had a market cap of less than $200 billion. So basically forecasting multiples of gains in that stock, and investors piled into it, pushing it up 32%. HPE had a phenomenal day, kind of an old school company that has found new life in this server build out. Meanwhile, in the retail space, you saw Nike on the back foot there, and the meme stock that had been sort of the meme stock of the moment, SPCE, not SpaceX, but Virgin Galactic, it had soared 200% over the previous 7 sessions, largely because of bets that people would mistake that company for SpaceX. But that's sold off today in a big way.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, absolutely. Down 39%. In fact, that was the biggest one-day drop for that stock. And yes, believe it or not, Joe, that is exactly why it had surged. Everyone betting that a lot of people would make that mistake. It's been made before in the past with other IPOs here. But I guess maybe some people came to their senses today and said, you know what, enough's enough.
Yeah, ticker confusion. You hate to see it. Joe also mentioned Palo Alto Networks off the back of the conversation we were just having with the congressman on this AI executive order around cyber risks that AI can expose in particular. That's the story here, right?
Yeah, and that is the story. And Palo Alto Networks reported earnings. It is a cybersecurity company, and they were good. It beat in the most recent quarter, but more importantly, it gave guidance that seemed to suggest that there is going to be pretty meaningful revenue growth up ahead. Now, the company did not cite specifically U.S. Policy, but it did cite the idea that as we sort of hand over more of our lives and corporations hand more of their tasks to AI and those AI bots, the cybersecurity, whether it's protecting your internal networks or verifying identities, that's going to be much more important. Those shares higher by about 5% in the after-hours trade. CrowdStrike, I should point out, up 3%. They report tomorrow after the bell, so maybe a harbinger to come. And I do just want to point out just real quickly, we got earnings out of Ulta Beauty here as people continue to invest in their face. And a shameless plug, Kaylee and Joe, we're going to get Macy's earnings tomorrow before the bell. And I have an exclusive interview tomorrow with the Macy's CEO, Tony Spring, right here on the close tomorrow. There you go. Shameless plug.
Well, we'll look forward to that conversation, and we'll look forward to you recapping it for us in tomorrow's edition of Power Moves. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, thank you so much. And still ahead, 6 states, millions of voters, and several key primary votes taking place from coast to coast today. We'll dive into some of the marquee races next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lines alongside Joe Matthew. Right now, polls are open across 6 states, California, South Dakota, Montana, New Mexico, Iowa, and New Jersey, with voters making their choices in primary races for governor, Senate, House of Representatives, and more ahead of November's midterm elections. And joining us now for more is Nia-Malika Henderson, Bloomberg opinion columnist. So obviously, Nia, there's a lot we could talk about in terms of today's primaries. Yeah. A lot of the big ones are centered in California, whether it's the L.A. mayor's race, where reality TV star Spencer Pratt is actually a factor, or the gubernatorial race, which has been shaken up multiple times, most recently with the departure of Erik Swalwell.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at that governor's race in California, I feel like, Kamala, shouldn't you have given this a shot? Because she probably could have had a clear path to winning this thing. We'll see who shakes out of it tonight. The top 2 finishers will go head-to-head in a runoff. It looked like for a time that Republicans might shut out Democrats. Given that it's a jungle primary. But it looks like at least one Democrat will survive, if not 2. And you see the folks up there, Javier Becerra is in the lead in most of the polls I've seen. And then you've got Steve Hilton, who the president endorsed, and he kind of got ahead of steam. California is a blue state. It's likely that one of the Democrats, whether it's Becerra or Tom Steyer, comes out of it. But yeah, it's it's kind of amazing that it's been sort of up for grabs and a question as to who would actually win that race all these many months.
And a voter base for Democrats, at least, kind of wondering why we don't have more to pick from here.
Yeah.
We were in Los Angeles for the Milken conference, and I got to see firsthand what some of the political ads were like. It was every commercial break, Becerra, Steyer. Different for the mayoral contest, which I'd love your take on here, because it's getting so much talk because Spencer Pratt is suddenly the insurgent candidate. But when you consider the amount of money that was spent on ads, old-fashioned ads in the gubernatorial contest, and see what Pratt has done with AI videos and social media How do we rationalize his success?
Listen, we'll see how successful he is coming out of this, but he has certainly been successful in gaining lots of attention. He has kind of this story where he talks about his home being burned down in the Palisades fire, and that has kind of fueled his, for lack of a better word, anger and rage at the incumbent. And you see that anti-incumbency fervor throughout the country. How far it'll carry Spencer Pratt, along with his sort of clever, offbeat approach to the campaign he has, these AI-generated ads where he's like Batman and Karen Bass is the Joker. I mean, it's pretty amazing. It gets
the new era in politics.
It's the new era.
So. Can he make the runoff, do you think? That's the question.
We'll see. I think in some of the polls I've seen, he's like third, but he might sneak in there. Listen, head-to-head against another Democrat, it'll be hard to win. I think in some ways, for somebody like Spencer Pratt, this is like a test run, right? Can he kind of elevate his name enough, get another, reality show, and then be a contender for a bigger office, right? Whether it's, if another, Senate, president. There's an interesting ad or article in Politico that says in some ways somebody like Spencer Pratt is dangerous for somebody like J.D. Vance, right? Because it's this sort of kamikaze anti-incumbent weirdo gonzo campaign. And so we'll see how he does.
Indeed, and we're looking forward to those results. We're also going to be paying attention to results in Iowa specifically, because this is one of the states that is seen as a potential Democratic pickup opportunity for the Senate. It seems on the Republican side, it's likely to be Congresswoman Ashley Hinson. Democrat side is either Zach Walz or Josh Turek. And this is being painted not just as a potential Democratic pickup, but also a real test for who has the most power in the Democratic Party right now. Is it the Elizabeth Warren wing?
Right, or is it the Chuck Schumer wing? And this race is going on in other contests too, right? We saw it in Maine, we see it in Michigan, and of course we'll see what happens tonight. But Chuck Schumer is definitely on the ballot. You've got folks running this sort of anti-incumbency campaign again here, essentially saying folks have been in Washington too long and wanting to bring just a new ideology to the Democratic Party. And this is also, I think, the discussion that Democrats are having more broadly, right? Should you go with a centrist? Centrist didn't do so well.
Would that be the more likely to flip?
I think Iowa, Trump won Iowa by 13 points. Right, in 2024. It was the most of any presidential candidate since 1972. I still think Iowa is a fairly red state. And if I was to look at the list of the ways that Democrats could flip the different states, Iowa would not be on my list. But it is an interesting contest, the Democratic side, and the arguments they're making about is it the centrist or is it the progressive?
It is Joni Ernst's seat.
Exactly, who was essentially driven out of the party.
Well, that's right.
Add her to the list.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In our remaining moment, we're seeing the first ad today from a Democratic-backed nonprofit group using President Trump in his own words, saying, I'm not concerned about Americans' finances. It's an 8-figure buy. It's starting digital and on broadcast TV in Pennsylvania. Is this the message we get for the next 6 months?
Like every ad should be this. This is an 8-figure buy. More money, more ads. Like this is the essential argument that Democrats should be making. These are his own words. You don't even have to take it in context, out of context. It's bad, right? And so I do think this is where Democrats will go, and they're going to find some success. There's the anti-incumbency problem that Trump has and the Republicans have, and the affordability issue.
You notice they don't always write a new cold open for SNL. They just kind of do the news now. It's when sort of campaign ads are aligning with Saturday Night Live. Nia, it's great to have you with us. Bloomberg opinion columnist Nia-Malika Henderson on Balance of Power. The breaking news this hour, Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche says the DOJ plans for an anti-weaponization fund are over. We'll have much more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Look, we're not moving forward with the fund. You're right that there's a date that in the case in the East District of Virginia in June, but we are not moving forward with the fund, period. The reasons for the fund is something that President Trump talked about for a long time, which is the fact that there were a lot of people in this country who had their government weaponized against them. The reasons for the fund, I think, it remain as important as they were before, but we are not moving forward with the fund.
Not moving forward ever.
Correct.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington, where we heard from the acting attorney general today, Todd Blanche, testifying there on Capitol Hill as he faced questions from both sides of the aisle regarding the president's so-called anti-weaponization fund. That fund, as we first learned yesterday and Blanche just confirmed, will no longer be pursued. But tonight we can exclusively report at Bloomberg that U.S. officials are continuing with an agreement that bars the government from investigating past tax filings from the president, his family, and his businesses. No more audits. For more on the hearing playing out right now and the busy agenda facing lawmakers as they return to Washington, we turn to Bloomberg's Erik Wasson live from Capitol Hill. Erik, I'm curious the reaction specifically from Republican senators on that, who are bearing down on a reconciliation vote here, and this was holding things up. Senator John Kennedy, the Republican from Louisiana, said reconciliation looks like a broken arm with the bones sticking out. How about now?
It doesn't seem to be unlocked yet. You know, later in the hearing, Todd Blanche did confirm our exclusive Bloomberg scoop that Trump will not be facing any audits for any tax returns filed before this month. So again, that audit ban remains in place, and that's causing consternation. We have John Curtis, the senator from Utah, telling my colleague that he still has concerns about that. Aides telling me that the senators are going to continue to digest this testimony overnight. The Senate will not move on to that $72 billion spending bill for immigration enforcement tonight. They may do so tomorrow and try to ram it through by the end of the day Thursday. But as of right now, senators are still trying to digest this. There are other problems with the bill as well. The ongoing issue of the Trump ballroom, whether there'll be $200 million or more for that. Seems to be a tendency to take that out of the bill. That's not completely settled, and other issues as well. So there's still some consternation, but certainly this is a step forward in the eyes of John Thune and others who wanted and urged Todd Blanche to make a definitive statement under oath that this is permanently going away. It's not just abiding by a temporary judge's order to not go forward with the fund, but this fund that Democrats say would be a slush fund to pay political allies of the president, including those who rioted on January 6th, will not be going forward.
Well, so you've spoken well, Erik, to the dynamics in the Senate, but if they can get this reconciliation thing through, it's going to the House next. Do we have a clear understanding as to what the House will consider as being adequate resolution to these issues that you mentioned?
You know, the House has been having these very abbreviated weeks. They're not yet really in session yet. They're coming back tomorrow evening. We will be asking those questions, but certainly there was enough objections by moderate Republicans like Brian Fitzpatrick to the $1.8 billion fund that to the extent that it was existing, that would have been a major problem. And Speaker Johnson confirmed to my colleague that he did tell the president that on Monday, and that pretty much convinced the president he has to stop going forward with this fund. So we'll see if it's enough. The audit question, I think, really remains a problem for some. But again, it's all about getting 50 votes and enough votes in the House to pass this. And it sounds like they will probably be going forward, but we just don't know quite sure yet.
So what are the odds we get into a vote-a-rama by tomorrow night, Erik? We know the president wanted reconciliation on his desk the 1st of June. How close can they come?
Well, I think, there's 20 hours of debate. Once they start this, Democrats are probably going to take all the time they can. But yeah, it could start late Wednesday or early Thursday morning. I would say it's more likely than not, given this statement. I think a lot of Republicans will take this as a victory that they had actually influenced the president and he'd taken their concerns seriously. Of course, the audit issue is out there, but Thune, in a cryptic comment to my colleague, said, this seems more like the typical thing you see in a settlement, although we have yet to find any precedent of a president settling with himself and giving himself audit immunity. There seems to be a more willingness to tolerate that than the fund itself. And the idea that people who actually beat up cops on January 6th could have gotten a payment really outraged a lot of Republicans.
And finally, Erik, are we expecting in the House tomorrow that the War Powers resolution that was pulled before the recess will be put on the floor? And if so, what's the vote count going to look like?
that's looking like it's going to be likely, unless they can pass a rule that turns off this, it has to be voted by tomorrow. So, I think it probably could pass, with just a few votes. Again, absences are a big issue here in the House, but the ongoing issue with Iran, certainly the hiccups that have happened, this week for the negotiations, lend a lot of support for potentially passing that and sending a signal that we can't really ramp up hostilities with Iran, at least from the view of moderate Republicans and swing districts and Democrats.
All right, Bloomberg's Erik Wasson live on Capitol Hill this evening. Thank you so much. Meantime, at the White House, President Trump today signed a long-awaited executive order that directs the U.S. government to work alongside AI companies in an effort to prevent future cyber attacks. Under the order, companies would grant the U.S. government voluntary access to their cutting-edge AI tools up to 30 days before they're released to the public. That's shorter than the 90-day window in the initial version of the EO that President Trump postponed signing, saying he was worried it might undercut U.S. competition with China. Joining us now for more is Aalok Mehta, director of the Wadhwani AI Center at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's good to have you, Aalok, and obviously you also served in policy roles at the likes of Open AI. And we know that it was the industry side as well as David Sachs who initially had some hesitation about the original draft of the executive order. What does this scaled down one really accomplish in terms of achieving greater cybersecurity?
It's very unclear what the order is intending to do. The thing is that all of the major AI labs, or most of them, have already signed voluntary agreements with the government. They understand the importance of working with the government to test advanced models. They want to build robust public sector businesses. They also want to build trust in their technology. This is key both to adoption of their technology in the U.S. and abroad. And so they've signed agreements to partner particularly with the Department of Commerce for advanced testing. They also have agreed to a number of voluntary commitments through various processes, both internationally and nationally. And so the contents of the executive orders seem to replicate a lot of what companies are already doing voluntarily.
So is this just for show?
No, I think the administration is really concerned about the cybersecurity impacts of these advanced models. It wants to take action, but it's not a unitary actor. There are various different viewpoints on this issue within the administration, and so the executive order represents a compromise between parts of the administration that wanted to be more aggressive and parts of the administration that are more receptive to the concerns from industry.
Well, we know there were some titans of industry who didn't like the last version. Reports were that Zuckerberg was on the phone, Elon Musk was on the phone, and even David Sachs helped to pull the president back to the point where an event was canceled with jets in the air. Everybody was on their way to Washington for the big ceremony. Are they happy, presumably, with this? Is the industry celebrating this version?
I think it's really unclear. The version that came out is very similar to the version that was planned 2 weeks ago. The biggest change is that, as you mentioned, they dropped the voluntary period from 90 days to 30 days. In some ways, that doesn't seem like a big enough change to make the tech companies happy. I do think that there are parts of the administration that are worried about cybersecurity threats from these models and want to take action. I think they see signals that the public is really interested in regulation of AI, and this is their attempt to try to appease both of those viewpoints.
Yeah. Well, characterize the nature of that threat, because, of course, when Anthropic first warned everybody about Mythos, they said this is so dangerous that we're limiting its release, but it's now being released more widely. Should we interpret that as a signal that perhaps it doesn't have the public more access to, it doesn't have as extremely grave consequences as we were previously led to believe, or just that it was going to have to get out there in a bigger way eventually?
Yeah, so since Anthropic made its announcement around Mythos, we've seen other models, particularly models from OpenAI, that have similar capabilities. We've also seen that sort of external organizations have tested the model and found that in a lot of ways it does represent a step change in terms of capabilities. And so it does raise concerns, not just that it can detect vulnerabilities, but in particular that it can chain vulnerabilities together into broader attacks that are really put systems at broader risk of compromise. I think that what Anthropic is doing is releasing a version of the model that has been post-trained so that a lot of the more concerning capabilities have been removed. We'll have to see eventually what comes out, but I think they're still really cognizant of the risk that this model might pose. And so they're going to take steps. This has been their pattern before. They're going to take steps to try to reduce those risks. They're also moving to release the model slowly, so in phases. So right now they're expanding access to a bunch of additional trusted parties. We'll have to see how broadly they release this type of model with these particular capabilities in the future.
Aalok, we just have about a minute left. We heard from Palo Alto after the bell this evening. Stronger than expected results, stronger than expected forecast. This is a cybersecurity company. A night before we hear from CrowdStrike, specifically pointing to strong interest in agentic security offerings. These are companies that at one point had been lumped in with a lot of software makers, but have been surging recently because of Mythos. Are companies like Palo Alto and CrowdStrike the answer to these concerns?
They're definitely part of the answer. There's long been this idea that there's this defender's dilemma. It's a lot harder to defend networks than it is to attack networks, and that AI could be part of the solution, that because it could disproportionately help defenders scan through lots of logs and lots of attempts to penetrate networks. And so I do think that it's part of the solution. But securing against agents is difficult. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done to deal with the kind of risk that AI agents in particular pose.
Well, we appreciate you joining us today to talk about it. Aalok Mehta of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, we thank you for joining. Coming up, we'll have a lot more on Todd Blanche's news from Capitol Hill today, plus Bill Pulte as the new acting DNI. We'll play it to our political panel coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. In tonight's Power Brief, a kind of apocalypse is how some residents in Kyiv are describing last night's Russian attack that killed at least 18 people. Parts of the Ukrainian capital were lit on fire as Russian artillery rained down, causing the greatest devastation we've seen there in months. Russia's defense ministry saying guided weapons struck at least 10 defense plants in the city. And the attack came about a week after Russia's foreign minister told the U.S. to evacuate U.S. diplomats from the region. The U.S. has continued to keep its embassy open.
The Defense Department has now banned the press from the Pentagon press office, deeming it a sensitive compartmented information facility, SCIF. The Pentagon's acting spokesperson says the move was, quote, nothing controversial, and that it was made because department speechwriters now occupy the space. Still, it comes after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's repeated curtailments of media access in the Pentagon, including the enactment of unprecedented restrictions against journalists last October, culminating in a mass walkout from outlets. That policy, of course, was tossed out by a federal judge back in March.
And White House Correspondents' Dinner 2.0 is a go. With just a few hours ago, the White House Correspondents Association confirmed a new July 24th date for the dinner following the shooting and alleged assassination attempt that disrupted the annual gala in April. The president of the Correspondents Association saying, quote, we will not allow an act of violence to have the last word. And President Trump also weighed in, saying it will be a hot ticket. The event is set to take place under increased security following April's incident and not in the Hilton ballroom. Kaylee, I guess they're going to do this at the Waldorf with a much smaller ballroom.
Yes, a ballroom, though, that in President Trump's words, he built himself, as this was the former Trump hotel. So joining us now for more on that, but other stories we're following tonight is our evening's political panel. Megan Hayes, Democratic strategist and former special assistant to President Biden, alongside Republican strategist Ashley Davis, partner at S3 Group. Welcome to you both. Shortly before we came to air this evening, we heard from Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, who was testifying in Congress, who said that indeed The $1.8 billion weaponization fund is going to be definitively dropped. What will not be dropped, Ashley, apparently for the time being, is this policy that the IRS cannot audit the president, his family, or his businesses. So is this ultimately going to be enough for Republicans on the Hill?
I mean, we'll see. I mean, what I'm watching is you saw what Thune said this morning during the lunch, or this afternoon during the lunch, which is, let's see what happens in the House meeting. We're going to move forward with the reconciliation plan this month or this week. And he also said, if you have an issue with it or your boss does, please let us know. Mm-hmm. But we're really watching what Blanche says under his testimony. I think that was his way of saying that this is dead. Mm. I don't know if the Cassidys of the world or, now John Cornyn's of the world, if the president is not brought up in regards to him being able to be prosecuted, if that is enough or not, we'll see. But, I mean, this is going to be ugly. I mean, I think Megan and I were talking about this in the green room is, FISA is probably going to take this week up, which supposedly there's a bipartisan deal. So that happens this week, and then they start some procedural motions in the Senate. But this is going to be a battle the rest of the month.
All right. So what do you need to see to know that this is dead? The hand could come back out of the water like at the end of the horror movie is the fear.
I mean, I just think that Democrats don't have a lot of trust and faith in the administration that what they say is actually going to hold true.
Does it have to be codified in legislation?
I mean, I don't know what they're actually going to need to move it forward, but I do think they're going to need more than that testimony from Blanche. I also think the IRS thing is a big deal, and I think it's a big deal to the American people, and Democrats are facing midterms, and these are really important midterms to the Democrats, and people do not understand why the Trumps don't have to pay their taxes or have any audits, and why people can't see how much money they've made off of taxpayers and in their foreign investments. Those are going to be big issues for Democrats.
Well, and Democratic Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro got into this with Todd Blanche in the hearing we're talking about. Just take a listen to this.
This is all in writing. This is all. Can you tell us here today that you are going to disavow this, that you're going to rescind what you said to Ms. Meng in writing with these efforts? These three documents are in writing. Is that a yes or a no?
So I can't answer that yes or no. Do you want an answer?
Yeah.
Okay, so not yes or no. You gave me three documents. The only document I said we're not moving forward on today is the first document identified, which is the Anti-Weaponization Fund. There's still a settlement agreement, and there's still the second document I signed is not an addendum; it's a separate Attorney General order.
Okay. Okay. So, but you're not going to rescind the addendum, the second order.
No,
the only thing you're talking about here, so the blanket immunity is not something that you're going to move back on?
It's not blanket immunity. That's not true.
It is.
No, it's not.
Ashley?
Well, the whole conversation was a little painful, to be honest with you, between the two of them. But also, let's remember what the IRS did, which was there was a leak with the tax returns of the former president of the United States and his family. I mean, that's a problem. I'm not saying that makes up for everything else. Mm-hmm. But let's go to what happens in the Senate. I think that you will have Democrats during the vote-a-rama, which will happen during the reconciliation vote, no matter what, and Democrats can bring amendments up. They're going to bring amendments up based on the fund. Mm-hmm. Or, even the tax issue, but also the ballroom. And so where do you get this disgruntled group of Republicans that is now kind of growing that will vote for it or not? That's the real issue more than what just happened in that conversation.
So with the YOLO caucus, as it's being called, in mind, Republicans were reading, at least as of this morning, still didn't have the votes on reconciliation. Did that just change with this testimony, or that remains up in the air? Just to be clear,
I think it remains up in the air, depending on what amendments. If the Democrats bring up amendments that are so extreme, I think it will help Republicans. If they bring up amendments that are middle of the road, I think that you will have when you have John Kennedy say that he has issues with the fund, that's an issue. Some of the others don't bother me as much, but
I think it's more than just the weaponization fund. I also think it's the ballroom and some other things that he's asked that got the government to pay for, that I think that Democrats and some Republicans that are in really tough races heading into the midterms are going to have a problem with.
It's a political issue.
Yeah, and the YOLO caucus, I think they're
not
going
to stand for, by the way.
You only live once. That's John Cornyn's new reality.
I know,
Yeah.
but I mean, really.
We'll see if he lives it.
Switching gears from YOLO, I also want to talk about the tapping of Bill Pulte, the FHFA director, as acting director of national intelligence. Of course, Bill Pulte not only working in U.S. housing policy, he also led the charge against the likes of Lisa Cook and Adam Schiff on alleged mortgage fraud that he says he uncovered. If he is now going to have potentially access to the intelligence gathering of our entire intelligence apparatus, Megan, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a problem. I also think this is one of those things, the devil you know might be better than the devil you don't. Be careful what you wish for, because I think that people would rather have Tulsi Gabbard here than the housing person who did weaponize the mortgage documents against people. So it is a serious problem. I think that he's wholly unqualified, but so was Tulsi Gabbard. But here we are again. This is a really important position, but Donald Trump doesn't think that these positions are as important. And the American people, I don't think, understand how important our intelligence operation is and how disparate it really is. And that position is the one position that held it all together and was supposed to gather all these intelligence agencies together to make sure that we are safe and to make sure our national security was of the utmost priority. And having someone who has no intelligence background and then also can weaponize different pieces of this against people, that is a real problem. It's a problem for our national security, but it's also a problem for voters.
So I know Bill pretty well. I think that there's one word that the president is doing, and that's loyalty. I also think from just what I know, and it's not 100%, that he's acting, and it's going to take a long time for his security clearances to ever catch up to what he's able to see at the DNI.
Isn't that a problem? Don't we need to have somebody kind of ready for that job right now?
But there's a whole agency of people. Okay. I mean, but my point is I don't know if he's ever going to get the clearances in time to be able to see exactly what I've seen. But listen, it's a loyalty position for him right now.
Does that mean you expect a permanent DNI? No.
Oh, not before the midterms, no. Right. There's no way.
I'm not sure we'll ever get one. I mean, we also don't have a national security advisor. This is not a president that takes this sort of intelligence apparatus in our government seriously. Will Democrats throw a
gauntlet on this when it comes to renewing FISA? Or is that a separate conversation?
I think it's a separate conversation. I think that FISA is a different animal, and I think Democrats know it.
And Democrats want it done, too. Yeah, I think that's a pretty I think that if this deal was truly bipartisan, bicameral, I think you'll see like 300 votes in the House and 80 votes in the Senate.
You know who had to answer questions about this, by the way, on Bill Pulte? Dr. Oz. He was in the White House briefing room today, as we see this rotating cast of characters. Well, he didn't want to answer questions about this. Does this not underscore that there's kind of a challenge in having non-White House press secretaries doing the press briefing? Because you're not just getting questions pertaining to your specific agency or area of focus.
But you can also say, I can't answer it.
Right.
So it's pretty easy.
You worked in the press office in a different administration, the last one. This is a really hard job, whether you take the binder with you or not. What do you think of the rotation? It's like a different episode of The Apprentice. Every time somebody gets up there, well, we should note the current press secretary is on maternity leave.
So I do think there is a benefit to having some of these experts come and speak at the top half of the briefing. We used to do that all the time for when the different issue areas and different cabinet secretaries would come, or before we went on a foreign trip, Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, would do a briefing. And then the press secretary would take the domestic questions or other questions that it wasn't the expert. So there is a need to have the experts up there. I think it's super important. They should just also have some other people up there to answer questions. But also, we have to remember, there are a lot of press secretaries. Press has access to them. They can still get their questions answered for their different stories. It's just not in the public view.
Yeah.
But Oz is a trained media person. I mean,
well, fair enough if you're going to put someone on TV.
All right, Megan Hayes and Ashley Davis also clearly have plenty of media experience. Thank you for being part of our media experience. And we appreciate you joining us, of course. For more, you can check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. I'll meet you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.